joining, and welcome to Accelerating Big Data Analytics Applications with FPGAs and OpenCAPI. My name is Peter Hofstee. I work at IBM in Austin, Texas, and part-time at Delft Technical University in the Netherlands. Now that we've taken a look at the different way that you may define a better computer and looked at how accelerators can help you build better computers, in this submodule, we'll look at accelerator integration, look at the different ways in which you might bring an accelerator into your computer. So accelerator integration is not just about the physical location of the accelerator. It is also about the degree to which the accelerator shares the same view of system resources. So we'll talk about something called the abstraction gap, and I would urge you to pay special attention to that as we go through the following slides. This slide lists some of the accelerator integration points that we will consider. Near network acceleration, the domain of SmartNICs, near storage acceleration, you might have heard of smart storage, near memory acceleration, you might have heard of processing in memory, on CPU die acceleration, and then finally Incore acceleration. So first, let's look at accelerators integrated with the network adapter. So some of the functions that may be done there are activities like compression or decompression, decryption, encryption, and protocol stack acceleration, all the way to running the entire TCP/IP stack, of the accelerator. Decompression can be done transparently, but does require coordination with the other side of the network interface and standardization, as we discussed in an earlier module. Decryption, encryption requires protocol to provide the keys to the network accelerator. And unless you're only providing encryption on the network itself, and providing unencrypted data on either end. And in that case, again, it becomes more of a standardization question. Some of the advantages of integrating an accelerator in this place is efficiency and performance gains, such as reduced network bandwidth, and a potential of a latency reduction that might seem a little bit counterintuitive, but if you are bandwidth limited, then compression can actually lead to a latency reduction if you consider the amount of time that the entire file or record takes to be transferred. And another advantage is that if you integrate acceleration with the device, you would integrate just the right amount, for example, the amount of acceleration that is required to satisfy the network speed that the adapter supports. Some of the challenges with integrating an accelerator in the network adapter are first, what I call the abstraction gap, and we'll talk about this a few different times. So especially for a network adapter that operates at somewhat lower levels of abstraction, it may be difficult to, in the accelerator, do things that require an understanding of, for example, what might flow through a particular sockets interface. Because within the accelerator, which may be more packet-oriented, for example, the packets may not be handled in the order that is required to get that higher level view. A second challenge in the case of, for example, compression is that while you get the benefit on the network, you don't get the bandwidth benefit on the CPU to NIC interface, and that can be a limiter. The next challenge is standardization requirements, as I mentioned, in the case of security or compression that has to go across the network and supported within the accelerator itself rather than the CPU. And finally, security can be an issue. So the degree to which you trust a network adapter may be different than the degree to which you trust the CPU itself. Next, let's look at accelerators integrated with storage, also known as smart storage. Compression, decompression, decryption, encryption are good examples, as is filtering. If you have a lot of data stored on a device, you may be interested in reducing the amount of data that needs to be brought to the host and finding only the data of interest. The advantage of this kind of accelerator integration is, again, that it's co-optimized with the storage device. So as in the network case, you can match the bandwidth and latency of your accelerator with the storage medium that is sitting on the same device. And in the case of a flash-based storage, you could even co-optimize your accelerator with, say, the flash translation layer. The challenges are, again, similar to those of a network adapter. There is also here an abstraction gap. A storage device, in most cases, is architected to operate on blocks rather than files. And whereas the operations that you may want to perform would be typically on things like objects or files. So somehow, your smart storage device needs to be able to bridge this abstraction gap. The next is storage to CPU bandwidth. Same argument as in the case of the network device. The reduction in bandwidth, applies to the storage medium if it's integrated with the storage adapter, and not necessarily to the storage to CPU interface. And finally, storage is a removable medium, so care must be taken that if you provide the storage adapter with keys, that key doesn't become at risk when the storage medium is removed. And of course, it can also be a consideration when storage is shared between multiple users. As you might expect, near memory acceleration is conceptually very similar to near storage acceleration. Some of the advantages that may be a little bit more pronounced in this case is reduced power, especially if you use something like 3D stacked memory on top of the accelerator, or truly integrate the accelerator within the DRAM device itself. You will not be able to beat the power compared to the case where the memory has to be transferred, content of memory has to be transferred to a CPU. And also, of course, at those locations, you have the highest memory bandwidth available. The challenges here are that, of course, if you put a compressor there, it reduces the bandwidth between the compressor and the DRAM memory, but that's not really where you were most bandwidth constrained. You were probably more bandwidth constrained on the interface between the CPU and the memory. So by placing a compressor near the memory, you didn't help that bandwidth, even though you still helped capacity. There's an important abstraction gap also in this case, because in memory, you typically deal with physical addresses, whereas your programs and problems deal with virtual addresses, especially if you do operations defined in user space, rather than use this as an accelerator for firmware or the operating system. And then also in this case, security might be an issue for similar reasons that I mentioned with the near storage acceleration. Another place to integrate an accelerator is on the CPU die. I mentioned gzip accelerators before, which are now becoming more commonplace as an integrated unit within the CPU. And here I differentiate between in-core and on-die accelerators. So the accelerators that I'm talking about here are on the die, but not in core. Security accelerators that can encrypt a certain region of memory, for example, or AI accelerators that might be a unit that helps you provide inferencing at a faster rate. The benefits of doing the acceleration on die is that there is less of an abstraction gap. But I should point out that the physical location of the accelerator here is actually less important than whether the accelerator shares in the addressing of the rest of the CPU, in particular, if it has an MMU associated with it. My experience is that an accelerator, even if it's on die, if it doesn't have an associated MMU, it basically ends up being an OS-only accelerator. So some of the challenges, if you integrate the accelerator on the CPU, of course, you can apply it for a variety of uses, like network storage or other uses. But all of the support for those uses does have to be provided through the layers of the software stack, which tends to be less transparent and more work than an accelerator integrated with a device for a particular purpose. And what was a benefit for integrating an accelerator with a device that its performance could be matched to the characteristics of that device, of course, is not a benefit here, right? If you if you have an accelerator that you're going to use for storage or network applications, for example, and you have a variety of system configurations, then in some of these system configurations, the acceleration may be over-provisioned, and in others, it may be under-provisioned. The last accelerator integration point we'll consider is in-core acceleration. And some people may not call this an accelerator. In this case, the function to be accelerated is supported with specialized instructions, right? And you're familiar with these floating point instructions, SIMD vector instructions, crypto-specific instructions within the CPU are all examples. A key advantage is that integrating it with the CPU itself is the least latency to invoke a general purpose accelerator. And it supports, and therefore, because it is the lowest latency, it supports the lowest granularity. Some key challenges are ISA proliferation. You end up with very large instruction sets this way. And all of the enablement has to be done by the CPU vendor, who sometimes has to guess at which uses of this acceleration is going to be most prevalent. The key question is, how the accelerator is architecturally integrated. And this is often more important than where it physically resides. This is where we will talk about OpenCAPI and similar interfaces in the future, right? So the physical location of the accelerator is less important than whether it has a shared view of system memory and whether it can coherently access system memory. So the typical answer today is no. Most accelerators depend on a CPU to transfer data to buffers that the accelerator can access. And in many cases, in most cases, the ability of the accelerator to access those buffers is not coherent. So a driver on the host CPU may need to be aware to flush its caches in order to make data visible to the accelerator, for example. Summarize some of the things we've discussed. Integrating an accelerator near a device, whether it's a piece of storage, memory, or a network, has certain advantages. It is sized right, and often, but not always, will dissipate less power than the equivalent operation on the CPU, where data would have had to first be transferred to the CPU, or more data might have had to be transferred to the CPU. There are challenges. The biggest challenge, I would argue, is the abstraction gap. The fact that the accelerator typically has a much more limited view of the problem state than the CPU does. Other challenges is that the connection between the CPU and the accelerator may be of limited bandwidth. And there are security considerations. It may be more difficult to trust an accelerator the further away from the CPU core it is. And I would again emphasize that this abstraction gap that I mentioned is actually a consequence of the interface. It's not a consequence of the physical proximity of the media to the accelerator. And we will address this issue in Module 2. But first, we will look at a few examples.